The first thing on the stone was the hair. One thick rope of honey blonde, still warm from the scalp it had been cut from, lying coiled on the frost-gray flagstones of the outer parapet, like something that had crawled there to die. The iron shears closed again above it with a sound like a gate latch dropping, flat and final, and a second hank fell, paler than the first because it came from closer to the nape. There was no wind to move it. The cold air held the strands exactly where they landed, and the early sun, weak and red as a struck coal, made them look almost wet. Pull the frame back and there was a girl beneath the shears. She was kneeling in a cream gown, the kind sewn over a winter of careful nights, the kind a hold spent its dye allowance on when it wanted to look bridal without saying the word aloud. The gown was already wrong on her, slipping off one shoulder because no one had laced it for ceremony, only for spectacle. Her hands rested open on her thighs, palms up, fingers loose, as though she had decided that closing them would be a kind of lie. Her chin was high. Her eyes were on the southern ridge, where the smoke from the burning villages rose in 3 separate columns, leaning slightly east on a wind she could not feel. Pull the frame back further, and there was the woman behind her. Lady Maeve of House Thorn stood with one hand fisted in what remained of Aira's hair at the crown, and the other working the shears in slow, measured opens and closes, like a woman pruning a fruit tree she had grown bored of. Maeve was not rushing. Maeve was, in fact, taking a kind of pleasure in the slowness, because the slowness was the point. Anyone watching from the gatehouse would understand exactly what was being done, and exactly who was doing it. And that public clarity was the whole architecture of the morning. Pull the frame back one more time, almost as an afterthought of the eye, and there, at the far end of the parapet, where the wall turned and the wind came in over the inner bailey, stood a fur-cloaked figure who had not moved in some time. He was tall. The fur on his shoulders was black wolf, banded silver at the tips, and his hood was down. His hair was the color of wet slate, and his hands were loose at his sides, the right one resting near the hilt of a sword he had not yet touched. He had been standing there long enough that the rime of frost on the merlawn beside him had begun to thaw under the heat of his palm where it had rested earlier. He had been standing there since before the first cut. No one in the courtyard below had looked up. No one on the parapet had turned. Lady Maeve, who prided herself on knowing every face inside her walls, had not yet registered that her audience was not the one she had arranged. What Maeve did not know, and what the falling hair did not know, and what the kneeling girl did not yet know either, was that the wolf inside the fur-cloaked man had been reading the air of this parapet since the moment its master had come over the wall, and the wolf had already decided. The wolf had decided in the first heartbeat after the scent crossed it, which was the heartbeat in which the first lock of honey blonde had touched the stone. The man's human mind was still catching up to what the wolf had done, but the wolf did not care. The wolf was older than the man, and the wolf had recognized the throat in front of it from 1,000 strides away. So the shears went on closing, and the hair went on falling, and somewhere down in the lower ward, a war horn from the southern villages sounded once, low and choked, the way horns sound when the man blowing them has been running too long. Aira heard the horn the way she had heard everything else that morning, from a great distance, through a layer of cold glass. She did not flinch. 12 years of living in Maeve's house had taught her that flinching was the door Maeve used to enter you, and so she had taken the hinges off that door a long time ago. She had not yet looked at the stone in front of her. She did not need to. She could feel the lightness on her scalp as Maeve worked, the way a tree must feel when it sheds the last of an October. She kept her eyes on the smoke and counted the columns. 3, always 3, in the old stories. 3 columns of smoke meant the King of the Iron North had ridden out himself, and meant that whatever village had refused him at dawn would not exist by noon. Era had read those stories as a child in the corner of Maeve's library, in the years before Maeve had understood what color Era's hair really was, in the years when Era had been allowed to read at all. She had been 9 when Maeve first looked at her in full sun and went very still in the face. She had been 9 when the dresses had begun to come in muddy colors only, and the hoods had begun to be required indoors, and the corner of the library had been locked. She had been 9 when the household had started calling her Ward instead of daughter. She had not been told why for a long time. She had been told, eventually, by a drunk groom in the stable who pitied her, that her hair was the color of a thing the king of the Iron North hunted, and that it was a color you survived by hiding. She had hidden it. For 12 years she had hidden it, under hoods, under ash rubbed into the part, under the simple choice of never walking in direct light. And this morning, before the dawn had fully come, Maeve had walked into her room with 2 house guards and a clean cream gown over her arm, and had said, very pleasantly, "Today we are going to fix the problem of you." And here they were. The shears closed. Another lock fell. Era heard, behind her and a little to the right, the small, wet click of Maeve's tongue against her teeth, the sound Maeve made when she was satisfied with a stitch. From down in the courtyard, finally, someone looked up. It was a kitchen girl with the yoke of water across her shoulders, and her mouth fell open and stayed open, and the yoke tipped, and one of the buckets emptied across her own boots, and she did not notice. The kitchen girl did not scream. No one in the hold screamed when Maeve was working. The silence on the parapet thickened, the way milk thickens before it turns. And into that silence, the man at the far end of the wall finally moved. He moved 1 step, only one. The fur on his shoulders shifted. The frost on the merlon under his hand cracked very faintly with the change of pressure. Maeve, who had been about to take the long final sweep across the back of Era's skull, paused with the shears half open. She had not heard him. The wind was wrong for hearing him, but something in the architecture of the air on the parapet had changed, the way a room changes when a candle goes out in another room entirely. And Maeve's iron pruner's instinct picked it up before her ears did. She turned her head a 1/4 inch, no more, the way a hawk turns when it has registered a second hawk in its sky. Her eyes found him. She did not, at first, understand what she was looking at. She saw the fur and the height and the stillness, and her mind offered her a sequence of acceptable explanations, each of which her face tried on in turn. A late-arriving lord. A scout from the king's outriders who had got ahead of his line. A messenger. Her face tried each of these and discarded each, because none of them explained the absolute lack of motion, and none of them explained why the kitchen girl in the courtyard had begun, very slowly, to kneel. By the time Maeve's mind arrived at the correct explanation, the explanation had already arrived at her. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The man on the parapet simply let the morning sun, which had finally cleared the eastern wall, fall across his face, and the iron pendant at his throat caught the light. And the pendant was a wolf's head, wrought in black iron, with a single chip of pale stone for the eye, and every soul in the Iron North had been raised on the shape of that pendant. Maeve's hand opened, the shears fell. They struck the stone 2 inches from the coiled rope of Era's hair, and the sound was the same sound, iron on stone, but smaller now, the sound of a thing that has finished being a tool and become only an object. Era, who had still not turned, felt the absence of Maeve's grip at her crown, and finally, slowly, looked up. She did not look at Maeve. She looked past Maeve, along the parapet, because the parapet had gone quiet in a new way, and Era had learned over 12 years in this house to read silences the way other people read faces. The first thing she saw of him was the cloak, because the cloak moved very slightly in a wind she still could not feel. And the second thing she saw was his eyes. And the eyes were not the eyes of a man. They were a man's eyes housing something else. Something that had been sitting behind the man's face for some time, waiting to be noticed. And now that she had noticed it, the something else met her gaze directly. Along the line of her throat, just below the angle of her jaw, the skin warmed. Not all over, only in one narrow band, like a coal had been laid against her in the night and forgotten there. It was the place where, in the stories she had read in Maeve's locked corner, a wolf king laid his bite when he claimed. The warmth was not painful. It was banked, the way a cook fire is banked under ash to keep through the dark hours, and it had clearly been banked there a long time, and only now, with him in the same air as her, had she been given the language to feel it. She did not gasp. She did not move. She held his eyes and let the warmth do whatever it intended to do. And she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that her stepmother had just completed an act in front of the only witness it was designed to deceive. The understanding made her smile. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been told for 12 years that her own life was a problem to be solved, and who had just watched the solution fail, in public, on stone, with a witness. Maeve saw the smile. Maeve had spent 20 years studying Era's face for exactly this kind of thing, and Maeve's own face, which had been arranging itself into a courtly greeting, slipped at the edges and showed for the first time that morning something close to fear. The man at the end of the parapet began to walk. He did not hurry. The fur on his shoulders moved with him, and the iron pendant swung once at his chest, and his boot falls on the frost stone were not loud, because he had been trained out of loud boot falls in childhood, but they were precisely spaced, and the precision of them was its own kind of announcement. The two house guards at Maeve's shoulder, who had been standing there with their hands on their belts watching the shearing with the bored attention of men who had been promised coin, looked at each other, and then at the approaching cloak, and then at the courtyard, and then at the gate, and one of them, the younger one, sat down. He simply sat down on the stone, as though his knees had been removed from inside his legs. The older guard remained standing only because his back was against the Merlon, and the Merlon was holding him up. Maeve found her voice. Her voice, when she found it, was the voice she used at high table, when an unexpected guest had to be flattered into staying for the soup. "My lord," she said brightly, "you honor our walls. We did not expect—" The man did not stop walking. "We did not expect—" Maeve tried again, and her voice cracked on the word expect, because the word was a confession, and she heard herself confessing it. He stopped 4 strides from her. From this close, Era could see that the silver at the tips of his fur was not silver at all, but very fine white, the white that came on a wolf in deep winter, and that the iron pendant at his throat was older than the keep they stood in. He did not look at Maeve. He looked at Era. "Stand up," he said. It was not loud. It was the voice of a man who had not had to be loud in a very long time. Era looked at the hair on the stones. She looked at the shears. She looked at her own hands, which were still open on her thighs. She put her right hand flat on the flagstone and pushed, and her legs, which had been kneeling for what felt like an hour, accepted the weight slowly. She stood. The cream gown slid further off the one shoulder. She did not pull it up. He took the cloak from his own shoulders in a single movement that did not look practiced and could only have been practiced, and he did not hand it to her, because handing implies negotiation. He stepped close enough that the heat of him touched her, and he settled the fur around her shoulders himself, and his knuckles brushed the line of her bare throat, where the banked coal sat under the skin, and he did not react to the brush, except that something behind his eyes went very still, the way a wolf goes still before it decides what kind of still to be. The cloak was heavy. It smelled of pine smoke and cold stone, and something else underneath, something that was simply him, and Era's body, which had spent 12 years being a problem, identified the underneath scent the way a hand identifies its own glove. Maeve, who had been edging sideways toward the inner stair, found that she could not edge any further, because the older house guard against the Merlin had finally fainted and slid down the wall and was now occupying the space she had intended to step into. She stopped. She drew herself up. She tried, in the only currency she had, to bargain. "My lord," she said, "this girl is a ward of my house. She is not what you are looking for." He turned his head finally to look at her. He did it slowly. He looked at her for perhaps 3 breaths, no more. He did not speak. The look itself was the sentence. Maeve's face emptied out by degrees, the way a cup empties when you tip it slowly over a sink. And by the 3rd breath, there was nothing in her face but the understanding that she had performed her life's most careful act in front of the wrong audience, and that there was no version of the rest of the morning in which she walked off this parapet on her own terms. Down in the courtyard, the kitchen girl was still kneeling in the spilled water, and one by one the other servants who had drifted into the ward to see what the silence was about were kneeling too. They were not kneeling to Maeve. The man, whose name had not yet been spoken aloud on this parapet, but whom every one of those servants knew, turned back to Era. "We will go inside," he said. The voice was still not loud. He did not offer his arm. You waited. Era gathered the fur cloak more tightly around herself because her shoulders had begun to shake, not with fear, but with the simple cold of being mostly bare on stone in the wind, and she stepped forward. As she stepped, she looked down once at the rope of honey blonde lying on the flagstone between them. He looked down at it too. His jaw flexed once, the muscle in it jumping under the skin, and then he stepped over the hair without disturbing it, because he understood, the way she understood, that the hair on the stone was now evidence and would need to remain exactly where it had fallen until it had been seen by everyone who needed to see it. They walked the length of the parapet together. Behind them, Maeve stood alone in a circle of fallen hair and fallen shears and one fainted guard, and she did not follow, because no one had told her she could. Inside the keep, the corridors had gone strange. Servants who had passed Era 1,000 times without seeing her now pressed themselves into doorways and looked at her with the wide, quiet eyes of people who have been told a story all their lives and have just seen the story walk past them in cloth shoes. The king, and that was what he was, she had finally allowed the word to sit in her own head. King, Alpha of the Iron North, the man whose outriders had been seen on the eastern road for 3 days, walked half a step behind her right shoulder, not leading, not following, occupying the precise position from which a thing could be guarded without being possessed. He did not touch her again. He did not need to. The cloak did most of the work. She could feel the weight of it on her shoulders and the line of his body in the air beside her, and the banked coal along her throat, which had not faded since he stepped close on the parapet, but had also not grown, as though it had been waiting 12 years to find its exact temperature, and had now found it, and would simply stay. They came down into the great hall, which was empty because Maeve had emptied it that morning for the spectacle outside, and at the long table at the far end there was already a man waiting, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, in the same black wolf-banded fur but cut shorter, a captain's cut. He stood when they came in, and his eyes went first to the king and then, very briefly, to the cloak on Era's shoulders, and then to Era's shorn head, and then back to the king, and a muscle in his jaw did the same single jump the king's had done on the parapet. "My lord," the captain said. The king did not break stride. "Callan," he said, "the southern villages." "2 more burning since dawn," Callan said. "The riders we took alive say it was the Iron Tooth band again, paid coin from inside these walls." The king's hand, which had been resting at the small of Era's back without touching the gown, closed briefly into a fist and then opened again. Era felt the air around him change with the closing of the fist, the way a room changes when a window is opened onto winter. From the corridor behind them came a small sound, and the small sound was the thing that broke the moment. It was a child crying, but not loudly. The bitten down kind of crying that children do when they have been told that crying out loud is dangerous. Era turned before the king did. She had spent 12 years learning to hear sounds at the edges of rooms, and the sound at this edge cut through her in a way the king's fist had not. A young soldier had come in through the side door with a small bundle wrapped in a man's outer cloak, and the bundle had a face, and the face had soot on it, and tear tracks through the soot, and the face belonged to a girl of perhaps 6. The soldier looked, panicked, at his captain. "Sir," he said, "we found her in the second village. Her mother put her down a well to hide her. We only just got her up. I didn't know where to." He trailed off. The king's hand at Era's back lifted, because Era had already stepped away from it. She crossed the hall in a way that did not look hurried, but covered the distance very quickly, and at the soldier, she did not reach for the bundle. She knelt. She went down onto one knee on the cold flagstone of her own great hall, in the cream gown and the borrowed fur, with her shorn head bare to the air, and she put herself at the height of the child's face, and she did not speak first. The child looked at her. The child looked at her hair, which was not hair anymore, and then at her eyes, and then, with a strange, unerring economy of children, at the cloak. "You're cold," the child said. "A little," she said. She kept her voice exactly where it was. "What's your name?" "Isbel," the child said. "Isbel," Era said. She tried the name on. It fit her mouth like a small, warm stone. "Isbel, are you hurt?" Isbel considered the question with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can bring to it. "My knee," she said, "from the rope." "Will you let me look at it?" Isabel nodded. Era unwound the soldier's cloak enough to find the knee, which was scraped raw down one side and crusted with well grit, and she did not flinch from it, and she did not coo over it, because cooing was a thing adults did to perform tenderness for other adults, and Isabel was not an audience. Era simply pressed her palm gently to the skin above the scrape to test for heat, and asked Isabel to bend the knee, and watched the bend and said, "It will mend, but we will wash it first with warm water and a clean cloth, and you will tell me if anything hurts more than the skin." Isabel, who had clearly been braced for either pity or dismissal and had received instead competence, exhaled a breath that seemed to take half her small body with it, and she put one filthy hand flat on Era's bare collarbone, just above where the cloak fell open, and she left it there. The hand was very warm. The hall behind Era had gone quiet. She did not need to turn to know that the king was watching. She could feel his attention, the way a plant feels light. She finished with the knee. She rewrapped the cloak. She stood slowly, so as not to dislodge Isabel's hand, and Isabel's hand simply rode up with her and stayed on her collarbone, fingers spread, the way a smaller animal puts its paw on a larger one to claim. Era turned. The king was looking at the child's hand on her skin. His face did not move, but something in the room moved, the way the air moves before a storm decides which side of the valley to walk down. He said to the soldier, "More of them." "There will be more," the soldier said, soft, ashamed. "From every village we ride into." The king nodded once. He said to Callan, "Every child that comes through the gate today comes to this hall first. Warm food, dry cloth, a healer. No one is questioned about their parents in front of them." Callan inclined his head. The king turned his attention back to Era and to Isabel, and to the small, filthy hand on Era's collarbone, and Era watched something in his face she could not name yet. Something that looked like a man recognizing the shape of a future he had not let himself plan. He took 2 steps toward them and stopped at a polite distance, because Isabel was small, and the king had clearly learned, somewhere, that men of his size could frighten small things by accident. He went down on one knee, the way Era had, and he was eye level with Isabel, and Isabel looked at his fangs, which were not visible, and at his hands, which were, and at his eyes, which were the man's eyes again now, mostly. And she did not flinch. "You came up from a well," the king said. Isabel nodded. "That was brave," the king said. Isabel considered this. "My mama was braver," she said. The king's face did the very still thing again. "Yes," he said, "she was." Isabel looked between him and Era with the open, evaluating expression of a small judge in a small court. "Are you her wolf?" she said to the king. The captain at the table behind them made a sound that was almost a laugh and turned it into a cough. The king did not look away from the child. He said very evenly, "I would like to be." Isabel turned the verdict over. She looked up at Era. She squinted. She said with the absolute authority of 6 years old, "Your hair will grow back. He still likes you." Era's throat closed entirely. She could not have spoken if a horn had blown over her head. She put her own hand over Isabel's small hand on her collarbone, and she held it there, and the banked coal at the line of her throat warmed by 1 degree and no more. And from one knee on the flagstone, the king watched the 2 of them with an expression that, if Era had been able to read it through her own tears, she would have called the expression of a man who had just been given evidence in a case he had been arguing alone for years. They were given rooms in the South Tower, which was the warmest part of the keep because it faced the morning sun. Era had never been in the South Tower. The South Tower had always been Maeve's daughter Sarah's wing, and Sarah, who was 17 and had been groomed for this morning since the age of 5, was nowhere in the keep. Era learned, from a hand-wringing chamberlain, that Sarah had been put on a horse before dawn and sent north to a cousin's hold, on the grounds that the morning's events should not be witnessed by a young woman of marriageable status. The chamberlain delivered this explanation while his eyes moved between Era's shorn head and the floor and his own hands. Era thanked him kindly. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that Sarah, who had never been cruel to her, but had also never quite looked at her, had been sent away because Maeve had finally understood, somewhere around the moment the iron pendant caught the sun on the parapet, that proximity to her own scheme was now a contagion. The chamberlain offered a bath, clean clothes, a healer, food. Era asked for the bath and the food, and said the healer should be sent first to Isabel, who was in the next room with a kitchen woman who had volunteered, the way certain women volunteer, the moment a child had appeared. The chamberlain bowed and went. She was alone for the first time since dawn. The room had a tall window with old greenish glass and a fire already built up in the grate, and a bed under a wolf pelt coverlet. And she stood in the middle of it for a long moment in the king's cloak, and did not know what to do with her body. She had never had a body that was not a problem. She walked to the window. The southern ridge was still smoking, but only one column now. The others had burned down to nothing. She could see, on the road below, a slow line of small figures coming up toward the gate. Women and children mostly, some men walking with limps, the survivors of the burnings being brought in by the king's outriders. She watched them for a long time. Behind her, the door opened without a knock, and she did not turn, because she already knew who it was. The banked coal at her throat told her. She had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that she would not pretend not to feel it. He came halfway into the room and stopped. He did not come closer. He said, "Your stepmother is in the lower hall under guard. She has not been touched. I would prefer that you tell me what you want done with her before I decide." Era did not turn from the window. She said, "You would let me decide." He was quiet a moment. He said, "You were the one on the stone." She thought about that. She thought about the 12 years. She thought about the hair on the flagstone of the parapet, which by her order had not been moved, and about Isabel's hand on her collarbone, and about the columns of smoke that had been 3 and were now 1. She said, "I do not want her killed. I do not want her in this hold. I want her sent to the smallest of her own family's holdings, with 2 of your men as escort, and I want the holding placed under your watch. And I want her never to be in a room with a child again." There was a pause behind her. He said, "That is mercy." She said, "It is also a cage." He said, "Yes." There was another pause, and then he said, "It will be done." She heard him move, but he did not leave. He came to stand at the window beside her, an arm's length away, not touching. She could feel the heat of him along the side of her body. The banked coal warmed by exactly 1 degree more and then settled, as if it had taken a reading and was content with the reading. She said, without looking at him, "You have not told me your name." He said, "Reese." He said it the way a man hands over a knife he does not intend to take back. She tasted the name in her mouth without speaking it. She said, "Reese, when did you come over the wall?" "Before first light," he said. "I rode ahead. The banner is half a day behind." She said, "Then you were on the parapet the whole time?" "Yes." She said, "Why did you not stop her?" He was quiet a long moment. He said, "Because if I had stopped her, you would have spent the rest of your life wondering whether I had decided for the hair or for the head it grew on. I needed her to finish. I needed every person in this keep to see her finish. And I needed you to know that I watched her finish and that it changed nothing." Era closed her eyes. The argument lived under her ribs for several breaths. It was a cruel calculation. It was also, she understood, the only calculation that gave her back the 12 years. She opened her eyes. She said, "That was a great deal to decide about a woman you had never met." He said, "I had met you." She turned her head finally and looked at him. He was looking out at the road, at the small line of survivors coming up to the gate, and his profile in the green window light was younger than she had thought on the parapet. He was perhaps 30. The gray in his hair was premature. She said, "When?" He said, "I was 19. There was a market at the crossroad below your hold. I was riding south, incognito, no banner. You were 10, perhaps 11. There was a boy with a kicked dog on the cart road, and you put yourself between the boot and the dog, and took the kick on your own hip and did not cry. And you carried the dog into the wood, and did not come out until you had cleaned the wound with stream water and bound it with the hem of your underdress. I watched from the trees. My wolf was very young then. He had never reacted to a human girl before. He reacted to you. I went home. I told no one. I have not, in 11 years, been able to scent any other woman as anything but absence. She did not breathe for a count of 4. She said, "You remembered the hip." He said, "I remembered the hem. I remembered the dog. I remembered the color of your hair before you started rubbing ash into it. I remembered that you spoke to the dog the way you spoke to Isabel just now, at its eye level, like it was a person." He paused. He said, "I have spent 11 years building a case. I came here today because the outriders confirmed the case, and because the southern villages were burning, and because I had decided that whether or not you accepted me, I would no longer leave you under a roof with a woman who measured you in shears." There was a long quiet. Outside, the wind shifted, and the last column of smoke from the southern ridge bent and finally thinned to nothing. Era said very low, "Did you know she would do this?" He said, "I did not know she would do it on the parapet. I knew she would do something. I rode through the night so that whatever it was would be done in my hearing." She said, "You might have been late." He said, "I rode hard." There was, for the first time, the smallest crack of something else in his voice under the control. And it was the crack of a man who had been afraid. She heard it and put her hand, without thinking about it, flat against his forearm where the sleeve ended. He did not move. He looked down at her hand. He said after a moment, "The claiming stone is in the grove east of the keep. By old law, if you accept, the ceremony is at the next dawn. By old law also, if you do not accept, I leave with my men and you remain free in this hold, with my protection on the walls and my mercy on your stepmother's exile, and no further claim from me, ever. The choice is not pressured. I would not have it be." Era looked at her hand on his forearm. She thought about the cream gown and the iron shears and the 12 years and the well Isabel had been put down and the dog at the crossroad and the banked coal at her throat that had been waiting all her life to find its temperature. She said, "Ask me at sundown." He inclined his head. He said, "Sundown." He turned to leave. At the door he paused and said without turning, "The hair on the parapet stays where it is until the ceremony. I would like the whole of the Iron North to ride in under banner and walk past it on their way to the grove." She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." And he was gone. The bath was hot and long, and she sat in it with her knees pulled up and let a woman she did not know wash the ash of 12 years out of what was left of her hair. The woman did not speak. The woman had been chosen, Era understood, because she did not speak. The hair was so short now that the washing took almost no time, and when it was done, the woman dried her with a linen sheet and dressed her in a simple, dark woolen gown that did not pretend to be ceremonial, because no one in the household had a ceremonial gown that fit her, and the cream one was evidence and would not be worn again. The woolen gown was warm. The wool had been combed soft. Era looked at herself in the polished disc of bronze that served as the South Tower's mirror, and saw a stranger with a fine pale skull and large gray eyes and a fur cloak across the bed behind her, and she was surprised to find that the stranger did not frighten her. Isabel was brought in for the noon meal. The healer had cleaned the knee and put a salve on it, and the knee was already less angry, and Isabel had been given a clean shift of her own and a small bowl of broth, and she ate with both hands cupped around the bowl, in the way of a child who had learned that bowls could be taken. Era sat on the floor across from her, because the chairs were too tall for Isabel's feet, and they ate together. Isabel said, between mouthfuls, "The lady with the shears." Era said, "Yes." Isabel said, Is she your mama? Era said, No. She was my father's wife. My father is dead. Isabel digested this. Isabel said, Is she going away? Era said, Yes, today. Isabel said, Good. The directness of it sat between them with the simple weight of a stone placed on a table. Era did not correct it. She did not perform a more generous answer for the child's moral education. Isabel had been put down a well that morning. Isabel had earned her stone. After the broth, Isabel climbed without asking into Era's lap and put her ear against Era's collarbone, on the same patch of skin she had laid her hand on in the hall, and went to sleep, immediately, the way only very young and very exhausted creatures can. Era sat with the weight of her on her thighs and the warmth of her against her ribs, and she thought about the word mama, which Isabel had used and then dropped, and she thought about how the body of a small child fits against the body of a not much older woman with no instruction at all. She had not, in any of the 12 years, allowed herself to think about children. Children had been a category that belonged to women whose hair did not need to be hidden. She thought about it now. She did not let herself decide anything. She only let the thought sit. The afternoon went past in a kind of suspended light. Outside, the courtyard slowly filled. The king's banner crested the ridge somewhere after midday, and the column came down the road in long, disciplined order. Black fur cloaks and wolf-head pennants, and outriders walking horses tired from the burning villages. And they came through the gate, and they passed the foot of the parapet stair, and every man and woman of them, as they passed, looked up at the rope of honey-blonde hair still lying on the flagstone above. None of them spoke. None of them stopped. They simply looked and went on. Era watched from the south tower window with Isabel asleep in her lap, and she understood that the king had told them, somehow, ahead of time, what to look at and why. By late afternoon, the Captain Callan came up to the south tower and asked, very correctly, whether the lady would receive her stepmother briefly before her stepmother was removed from the hold. Era said yes. She handed Isabel off to the kitchen woman, who took her with the calm efficiency of a person who had decided sometime that morning that this child was now hers to mind. And Era went down to the lower hall in the dark wool gown with the king's cloak across her shoulders, because the keep had gone cold with the lengthening shadows. Maeve was standing, not kneeling, in the center of the hall, with 2 of the king's men 3 paces behind her. She had not been bound. Her hair was still up. Her gown was the same one she had worn that morning to do the shearing, and there was, Era saw, a single pale hair caught on the front of her bodice from the work. Maeve had not noticed it. Era noticed it, and did not mention it. They looked at each other across the cold flagstones. Maeve said, in the high-light voice, "You understand, of course, that I did what I did to protect this house." Era said nothing. Maeve said, "The king hunts the sunline. You would not have survived the bond. The bite would have burned through you. I was sparing you." Era tilted her head a small degree. She said, "You have known what I was since I was 9. Maeve's face did the thing it had done on the parapet, the slipping at the edges. Era said, "You had 12 years to tell me. You had 12 years to write to him. You had 12 years to send me somewhere safe. You chose, instead, to dress your own daughter in my skin and to wait for the outriders. That is not protection." Maeve, who had clearly rehearsed several speeches in the lower hall, found that none of them fit the air in the room. She tried finally the last thing she had. She said, Sarah is innocent. Sarah knew nothing." Era said, "I know. Sarah was sent away this morning before the shearing. She has done nothing. She will not be touched. She will keep her allowance from my father's estate, and she will marry whom she chooses, and your name will not be removed from her, because your name is not the punishment. The cage is the punishment. You are going to the small holding in the western fells. You will not leave it. You will not be in a room alone with a child for the rest of your life. Maeve's mouth opened and closed. She said finally, "You do not have the authority." Era said, "No, he does, and he has given it to me." She did not raise her voice. She turned to Callan, who was at the door, and she said, "Take her now, please." Maeve, who had stood for 40 years on the principle that voices like hers were always obeyed, did not move when the men came forward, and the men picked her up under the elbows very gently and walked her out of her own hall. And the hall was emptier than it had ever been in Era's life. Era stood in the center of it for a long moment and listened to her own breath. She had not, until that moment, fully understood that the cage she had been carrying inside her ribs for 12 years had not been Maeve. The cage had been the absence of permission to name Maeve. The naming had taken the bars apart. She turned. The king was standing in the side doorway. He had been there, she understood, the whole time. He had not interfered. He had simply stood, the way he had stood on the parapet, and he had let the moment belong to her. He said, "Sundown soon." She said, "I know." She crossed the hall to him. She stopped close enough that the banked coal at her throat warmed once and stayed. She said, "Ask me." He looked at her. He said, "Will you stand with me at the claiming stone at dawn?" She said, "Yes." He did not move. He did not touch her. He said, "You can change your mind between now and dawn." She said, "I will not." He said, "You can change it during." She said, "I will not." He said, "You can change it after." She said, "Reese." He stopped. She said, "Ask me one more time at the stone, and then never again." He inclined his head. They stood there, in the cold hall, in the last of the afternoon, and neither of them moved. And Era understood that the part of him that had decided 11 years ago was now sitting very quietly behind his eyes and watching, and that the part of him that was the man was the part she had just given her word to, and that the two parts were not in conflict for the first time in 11 years. The evening passed strangely. The keep was full of strangers now, but they were quiet strangers. The king's men did not drink, they did not shout. They unloaded carts in the lower ward and set up bedrolls in the stable lofts and the great hall, and they did all of it with the disciplined hush of men who had ridden out of fire and were waiting to see what came next. The kitchens cooked steadily through the dusk, and bread and broth and meat went out to every soul in the keep, including the survivors from the southern villages, who were laid in rows of pallets in the long, disused upper gallery, with women of the keep and women of the king's column moving among them with basins and rags. Era went up to the gallery once at full dark. She had not been asked to. She had simply found, in the small space between deciding to go and going, that her legs were already on the stair. She brought a basin, and she brought rags, and she walked between the pallets, and she did not say very much. She washed a burn on a woman's forearm. She rebound a child's wrist. She knelt beside an old man who had lost his wife in the second village, and she put her hand on his shoulder and let him cry into the wool of the king's cloak, which she had not taken off, and which she understood now was part of the message. The king's column saw her doing this. They said nothing to her. They simply moved out of her way and back into her way as the work required, and she felt, for the first time in her life, the strange weightless sensation of being inside a current of people that was not actively trying to push her under. When she came down from the gallery near midnight, Isabel was waiting on the bottom stair, wrapped in a too big shawl and very serious. Era sat down on the stair next to her. Isabel said, "Are you going to be married tomorrow?" Era said, "Yes." Isabel said, "To the wolf?" Era said, "To Reese, who is a wolf as well." Isabel considered this. Isabel said, "Will I have to leave?" Era said, "No." Isabel said, with the patient repetition of children who have learned that adults lie by omission, "I won't have to leave." Era said, "You will stay here as long as you want to stay here. If your kin are found, you will go to them only if you want to go to them, and only after I have met them. If they are not found, you will stay. There is room. There will always be room." Isabel digested this. She said, "Will you be my mama?" The word was the second time that day. Era had been ready for it this time, but it still went into her under the ribs. She said slowly, "I will be the person who is here. I will be the person who kneels when you need me to. If mama is the word you want to use for that, you may use it. If a different word feels better later, you may use that instead." Isabel said, "Mama." She said it like she was testing a step on a stair. She said it again. "Mama." She nodded once, satisfied with the step, and put her head on Era's hip and went to sleep there on the stair. And Era had to carry her up to the south tower, which she did, and the king's men in the corridor stepped out of her way without comment, the way they had in the gallery. The king came to the south tower at first gray, before dawn. He knocked. He had not knocked all day, and the knock was its own message. Era opened the door in the wool gown with the fur cloak and her short hair, which had begun, in the warmth of the room, to lie down softly against her skull in a way she had not yet looked at. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "The Grove." She said, "The Grove." He said, "You have not changed your mind." She said, "Ask me one more time at the stone." He inclined his head. They went down through the keep together. Isabel was carried by the kitchen woman, wrapped in the soldier's cloak from the morning before, because Isabel had refused to be left behind, and Erda had not argued. Callan walked at the king's left shoulder. Two of the king's older men walked at Erda's right, not as guards, but as witnesses, because old law required 2 witnesses from the king's side and 2 from the ladies', and Erda's side, which was the household of House Thorne, had been hastily reassembled out of the chamberlain and the old steward and the kitchen girl who had dropped the yoke in the courtyard, all of whom had volunteered without being asked. They came out of the keep through the lesser eastern gate. The sky was the color of the inside of a shell, pale and lined with rose along the horizon. The grove was a short walk down a frosted path between 2 lines of bare oaks, and at the end of the path, the trees opened into a small clearing, and at the center of the clearing stood a single, tall, flat stone, gray, lichened, the height of a man's chest, with a hollow worn in its top from generations of palms. The stone was older than the keep. The stone was, Era understood, older than the house she had been born into, and the house she had been wronged in, and the house she was about to leave. There were perhaps 40 people already in the grove, the king's senior men, the captains of the keep, the chamberlain, the kitchen woman with Isabel in her arms. Callan took his place at the king's right. The 2 of the king's older men took their places at Era's right. The chamberlain, white in the face but steady, took his place at her left. They walked the last stretch together, Era and Reese, side by side but not touching, to the stone. At the stone, he turned to her. He said, low, "Will you stand with me at the claiming stone?" The third asking. She said, "I will." He said, "Do you accept the bond freely?" She said, "Freely." He said, "Do you accept it knowing that it cannot be undone?" She said, "Knowing." He said, "Do you accept it knowing what you are?" She said, "I have known what I am since I was 9. I have only just been allowed to say so." There was a small movement through the witnesses, an indrawn breath that traveled like wind over wheat. He nodded once. He said, "By old law, the claiming is mutual. The bite is mine to give. The throat is yours to bear. There is no claiming if the throat is not bared by your own hand." She lifted her hands. She unfastened the king's cloak at her own collarbone. She let it fall back from her shoulders and pool at her elbows. Underneath, the dark wool gown had a high collar, and she undid the small horn buttons herself, 3 of them, and folded the collar down, and tilted her head slowly to the side, baring the line of her throat where the banked coal had been warming all day. The grove went absolutely silent. There was no wind. There were no birds yet. Even the horses tied at the edge of the clearing had stopped shifting. Rhys lifted his right hand. He did not reach for her yet. He set his palm, deliberately, in the worn hollow on top of the stone, and the lichen under his palm went briefly silver, and then the silver lifted off the stone like mist off water, and the mist drifted into the air above them and settled into a thin, shining thread that hung in the gray dawn air between the stone and his palm. The old witnesses inhaled. The chamberlain made a small, involuntary sound. Aira understood without being told that this was the visible sign the stone gave when the bond it was asked to witness was a true one, and that no one in this grove had seen the stone give the sign in living memory. Rhys took his palm off the stone. The thread of silver did not vanish. It hung in the air, and then very slowly it bent, and the end of it drifted over and settled, of its own accord, against the bared line of Aira's throat, exactly where the banked coal sat. The coal answered, not loudly, not visibly, only she felt it, the way she had felt every degree of it through the day. It warmed once, fully, and held, and the silver thread sank into the skin and was simply gone, and where it had touched her, a faint, pale mark remained, the shape of a small crescent no larger than a thumbprint, lying along the line of her throat. She did not gasp. She lifted her eyes to his. He stepped close. He set his hand, gently, at the back of her neck, where the skin was still tender from the morning before. He bent his head. He paused with his mouth above the line of her throat, and he said, very low, only for her, last asking. She said, last yes. He set his teeth, carefully, against the place where the banked coal had warmed all her life waiting for him, and he bit, exactly hard enough and no harder, and she felt the small bright pain of it for one heartbeat, and then she felt the heat of the place open out under her skin like a door, and behind the door was him, the whole shape of him, the 11 years of waiting, the boy in the trees at 19, the man riding through the night to get to the parapet in time, the wolf that had decided across a courtyard before the first lock fell. She felt all of it at once. She did not stagger. She set her hand at the back of his neck in answer, and she opened her own self to him. The 12 years, the dog at the crossroad, the locked corner of the library, the kitchen girl with the dropped yoke, Isabel's hand on her collarbone, the rope of honey blonde lying on the flagstone above. She gave him the whole of it. He took it. She felt him take it, the way one feels a current take a leaf. He lifted his head from her throat slowly. There was a single small bead of her blood at the corner of his mouth, and he did not wipe it. He looked at her with the man's eyes and the wolf's eyes at once, both fully present, and there was no contradiction between them anymore. She lifted her free hand and, with her thumb, touched the bead at the corner of his mouth and pressed it gently into his lip, sealing it there. The witnesses, who had been holding a single shared breath for a count Era could not measure, finally exhaled. Behind her, the kitchen woman's grip on Isabel must have loosened, because Isabel slid down and ran the few short steps across the frost to them and stopped at Era's hip and looked up. Isabel said, "Your hair grew back a little already." Maurice laughed. It was the first time Era had heard him laugh. It was a quiet sound, low and rough and surprised, the laugh of a man who had not had much practice. He went down on one knee in the frost without letting go of Era's neck, and Isabel inspected the new pale mark on Era's throat with grave attention, and then put her small, filthy hand once more on Era's collarbone, just above the mark, and said, with the absolute calm of a 6-year-old delivering a verdict, "Good." The sun came over the eastern oaks. It struck the top of the claiming stone first, and then it struck Era's bared throat, and then it struck the shorn, pale fuzz of her head, and the light caught in it and made it briefly gold, and every witness in the grove saw, finally and openly and with no possible denial, the color of the sunline in full morning sun on the throat of the woman the king of the Iron North had just claimed. No one made a sound. There was nothing to say. Era lifted her face into the light, Reese, still on one knee, with one hand at the back of her neck and one hand resting on the small of Isabel's back, lifted his face into it as well. The banked coal along her throat, which had warmed by exactly 1 degree each time he had come closer to her across the day, did not warm again. It did not need to. It had arrived. There's something about that last bead of blood she pressed back into his lip, the small refusal to let any of it go to waste, that I find very hard to shake. If you had been Era on that stone, after 12 years of being hidden in your own house, would you have asked the 3rd time? Or would you have made him ask a 4th? I'd love to know what you think. See you in the next story.